All right, we're going to begin now. Sorry for the wait. We wanted to make sure some people could come because of the weather and everything. Thank you for coming tonight. I know it's a rainy night, so I'm happy this many people showed up and showed an interest. Tonight's discussion is supposed to be a legal, neutral-based forum to discuss the Iran nuclear deal. Nothing political, just strictly from a legal basis. So, we have to the far right, Hooman Movassagh. I said that right? Okay. He is a fellow at the Institute for Practical Ethics in Public Life at University of Virginia. Then we have next to him Professor Sellers from University of Baltimore School of Law. And next to him, Professor Jonas from Georgetown University School of Law. And our moderator tonight is Professor Kenneth Lassen from University of Baltimore School of Law. I'd also like to thank our sponsor tonight, which is the Simon Soboleff Law Society, which is essentially a Jewish bar organization here in Maryland. And we also have another donor, but they would like to remain anonymous, but I thank them as well. The program is going to proceed that there will be 4 panel questions that we've drafted. After the panel questions, there will be a chance for people to ask questions during the Q&A, which we're going to try to keep it, timed properly, but hopefully we'll start the Q&A by 8:30. So yeah, we'll get started with Professor Kenneth Lassen, who will give a brief overview of the Iran nuclear deal before we officially start the panel discussion. So thank you for coming.
Thanks, Ashley. Hello, and thank you all again for coming to this special event, especially on this dark and dreary evening. It's jointly sponsored, of course, by the Jewish Law Students Association at the University of Baltimore and the International Law Society at UB. I'm Kenneth Lassen. I'll be your moderator. And before getting to the panel, let me make a few introductory remarks and summarize what's the deal. I always hesitate to use that term, deal, involving something as momentous as the agreement, which is so perhaps ominous or certainly momentous. Deal implies, it seems to me, that the words and we'll follow or preceded, wheel and deal. And I think there was a lot of wheeling and dealing. I'm not sure that we'll be able to avoid political commentary tonight with something as contentious as this arrangement. What is it officially called? Well, it's officially called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA. It's an international agreement on the nuclear program of Iran, signed in Vienna on July 14th of this year, between Iran and the P5+1 and the European Union. The P5+1 are the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council: China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, plus Germany. Here's what the agreement states in a nutshell. Iran can continue to produce a small stock of uranium enriched at low levels, but not suitable for a bomb, without further processing. This limitation is supposed to be for 15 years from the time of the signing of the deal, or the arrangement. If Iran does indeed abide by the deal, it would not be able to make a bomb for at least a decade, because it would not, ostensibly would not have enough material or centrifuges running to produce a bomb worthy of weapons-grade uranium in less than a year. How can compliance be monitored? Inspectors can ask to visit sites of suspected nuclear activity, but the inspection provisions fall a good deal short of the anywhere, anytime language that was used to tout the deal when it was first announced. Why? Because the inspectors first need to present evidence to Iran, and then Iran has a period of time in which to prepare to host the inspectors. When will the existing sanctions be lifted? In practical terms, almost immediately. Major oil and financial sanctions could be removed in short order if Iran complies with the principal requirements of the deal. By sanctions, of course, I mean the sanctions that were in place for the past number of years that have effectively limited Iran's economy and brought it practically to a standstill. How can the United States be sure, the United States and the other countries be sure that Iran will comply with the deal? Well, they can't. Iran agreed to provide inspectors more access to its nuclear program and to allow investigation of suspicious sites, but there are no guarantees. There was just a promise to do that. How long will the deal last? The deal ostensibly limits Iran's enrichment for 15 years, caps its research and development, and those caps are loosened in 10 years. Some restrictions will remain for up to 25 years. I won't go into detail on that, and maybe some of our panelists will. In September of 2015, Congress voted to oppose the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the so-called deal, by bipartisan majorities in both houses on the grounds that it fails to close every pathway to an Iranian nuclear weapon. Nonetheless, the agreement with Iran will be implemented, and in some quarters has been implemented, and the United States and the other countries must now maintain, or are charged with maintaining, consistent and vigilant oversight to ensure Iranian compliance, and also be ready to move quickly against any violations of the arrangement. That's the long and the short of it. It runs for hundreds of pages, so that's really as quick a summary as I could make of it in the time we have allotted. So now to the questions that we've asked the panelists to address. You've met them, Professors Jonas, Movassagh, and Sellers. Each panelist will have 3 to 5 minutes to answer the question as I present them, and then they will be given an opportunity for a 2-minute rebuttal if warranted, at the conclusion of which we hope to have time for questions and answers from the audience before we wrap up for the evening. So the first question, and I guess we'll start with my immediate right with Professor Jonas, and the same question, of course, will be addressed by each of the panelists. If Iran breaches the deal, what are the obligations of the United States in correcting the breach, and would potential sanctions, at least the ones that I outlined, and maybe you have some others, would they be enough?
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me here tonight. I'm very happy to be with you and to talk about this deal. I am a professor, but I'm an adjunct professor, so I actually worked in this field for about over 15 years, both on the Joint Chiefs of Staff as Nuclear Nonproliferation Planner, and then as General Counsel for the National Nuclear Security Administration, which is about half of the Department of Energy, and I'm sure you saw the Department of Energy was quite involved with the Secretary of Energy heading over there with Secretary Kerry to conduct these negotiations. This question is somewhat problematic to me because the idea of if Iran breaches the deal, as if, oh my God, would they really do that? Well, they've been breaching deals all along. They have breached the legally binding. Now remember, this deal itself is not legally binding. but they are a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and have been for years. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is legally binding and requires that they will have a safeguards agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency to allow access to their sites. For 20 years, for the past 20 years, there has never been a single time that Iran has not been in violation of that safeguards agreement, where they haven't had some secret nuclear site not revealed to the IAEA, which the IAEA has not been allowed to inspect because they weren't aware of it. So they are most likely going to breach this deal. I sort of take that as a given. I have no evidence of this because I'm not an intelligence officer, and I certainly have been out of the government for about a year. But I think they have secret sites now, and I think they will have more as time goes on. I think it's clear that Iran wants a nuclear weapon and is in hot pursuit of one. So I believe they will breach the deal. But then what are the U.S.'s obligations? And let me just back up for 1 second on that. How do we identify a breach? Now, our vaunted intelligence agencies, 1998, I remember vividly, I was swimming around, literally swimming in the Pentagon swimming pool, and I got yanked out soaking wet to brief the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff because, India and Pakistan were testing nuclear weapons back in 1998. Well, we didn't know about that. It came as a complete surprise. Our billion-dollar intelligence agency hadn't a clue. Now, Iran is twice the size of Texas. It's not Monaco. So how we think we're going to be able to identify a breach when we can't get in there, and remember, we can't get in there. This deal prohibits not only the presence of American inspectors coming in as Americans, but even American inspectors coming in as inspectors under the aegis of the IAEA, even though we pay a third of the budget of the IAEA. So whoever negotiated that provision should be charged with malpractice if it's a lawyer. It's ridiculous. So if they breach, I think they will breach. How do we identify a breach? I'm not sure. We can only hope that the IAEA will be able to do it. And I think the IAEA is good. I've made 35 trips over to Vienna and dealt with the IAEA. They're professionals, they're a good organization, but they have limited resources, and I believe they will have limited access. So would potential sanctions be enough? Well, once these sanctions are removed, which of course the UN has now mandated, I think it's going to be very difficult to get them back in place, because particularly a lot of companies, a lot of European companies in particular, are going to start going over there doing business with Iran. They want to sign business deals. They want to make money. That's fine. That's the way business works. But once that happens, I believe it's going to be very difficult for these states to snap back sanctions. That's why I think the whole concept of snapback is utterly ridiculous and simply won't happen. And looking at the history of arms control agreements in the past, once they're signed, people kind of focus elsewhere and move on. So now this one, the world will be watching for sure, but what they'll actually be able to see, I think, remains to be seen. I think Iran is going to allow inspections at certain sites where nothing's going on, while they have stuff going on that they're not letting inspectors see.
Thank you. Professor Sellers.
First thing I want to make sure is that everyone can hear us. Can you hear us well? It's good. Okay, that's great. The second thing I want to do is thank the Jewish Law Student Organization and the International Law Society and their presidents, Ashley Wentz, who you saw already, and Suzanne Dedane. They're two of the most active, strong, always good societies at the University of Baltimore, and I'm grateful to them for organizing this event. These initial questions we're going to try and keep short, because the purpose of them is just to get you warmed up and thinking. And then when you're warmed up and thinking, you can start asking us questions, and we're eager to answer the questions that you actually have. So we're going to try and keep it brief at the beginning so that you can control what it is that we actually end up talking about. But just in response briefly to the question that we were given right now, if Iran breaches the deal, what can the U.S. do about it? And the answer is we can tell the IAEA, and then they'll do something about it. So the first thing the U.S. can do, the U.S. is not in a position to enforce the deal. Our job is done, and we've, as was just pointed out by the previous speaker, delegated inspection authority to someone else. So we have to hope that they're doing a good job. There is a backup if we're not satisfied. So if the United States isn't satisfied, we can go to a joint commission and express our dissatisfaction with how the thing is being respected. If the Joint Commission doesn't manage to solve this for us, there's an advisory board that's set up with people appointed by the U.S., by Iran, in this case, in other words, whoever's being complained against, and then with a neutral third person, and they can recommend a solution. And if the United States at that point is not satisfied, we have the power to take it to the Security Council, and the Security Council can be seized of the matter. And if the Security Council doesn't make an order, and we're not satisfied, then we get the snapback that Mr. Jonas talked about. So the United States can control whether or not the sanctions are put back on again, and these sanctions would be Article 41 sanctions under Chapter 7 of... that's the other thing. Actually, I slightly disagree with one of the things the previous speaker said about this being law or not. This is absolutely binding law because it is a Security Council resolution under Chapter 7. So although the agreement that President Obama entered into recently is only an executive agreement, which has very low legal status in the United States, the whole deal is now incorporated in a Security Council resolution under Chapter 7. But that resolution includes the power of the United States to get the sanctions reimposed, with the proviso that Mr. Jonas brought up that, you know, how well will they be enforced if they spring back? We can't know that. But I think the main message I would send to you on this issue, and it gets to the whole thing, is this train has left the station. Whether or not this is a good deal, and it may be a very bad deal, it's the deal we have now. And I think that's probably the main lesson of this first question, is that actually the United States, unless we are attacked, unless there's an armed attack against the United States or one of our allies, the Security Council resolution governs.
Thank you. Professor Movassagh.
I'm going to try to use a mic. Is that working? All right, thank you. First, thanks to Dave and Tim for their comments. I agree with some of them. I may have a rebuttal inside the comments I make. Before I begin, though, I'd like to thank Ashley Wentz at the Jewish Student Law Association and Suzanne Dedine, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly this time, from the International Law Society. We've been getting emails from them for about 3 months. They've done a lot of work preparing this, and so thanks to both of you for that. I'd also like to comment on something Professor Lawson said before I get into the question itself. The caps on Iran's program will be lifted under the JCPOA. In other words, the caps that you mentioned, the 10 years, 15 years, 25 years, these will be lifted, but these are caps that have been imposed by the JCPOA itself. The JCPOA imposes certain restrictions on Iran's nuclear program that are far in excess of any international undertaking Iran has, or any other state, for instance, for that matter, has under international law. The NPT, the IAEA safeguards, the subsidiary arrangements, and the additional protocol. While these caps will be lifted after 25 years, those safeguards and those regulations and the verification system of the IAEA will continue to be in effect. Now, I too have an issue with the question, but I think it's the converse of what Professor Jonas said. It's true that Iran has been in violation of certain of its obligations in the past 20 odd years. But we have to go back further in history, I would say. With Iran, you usually have to have a historical perspective. The nuclear program in Iran was actually initiated by the U.S. itself. In 1975, Hooman Ansari, the Minister for Economy and Finance, signed an agreement with none other than Henry Kissinger, the U.S. Secretary of State at the time. And by that contract, Iran was to receive 8 nuclear power plants worth $6.4 billion. Work on the Bouchard power plant, which is now close to operation, was initiated by Siemens AG, a German company. But after the revolution, obviously, none of those agreements were honored. Iran looked to Russia. Iran also has 10% share in Eurodif, which operates, it's a consortium of France, I think it's the UK, and Iran, which has a uranium enrichment facility in the southeast of France. Iran has 10% shares in that. They did not provide fuel to Iran. Faced with these obstacles, obviously, they looked elsewhere. They went to Russia to complete the nuclear power plant in Bouchard. And they basically had no other choice. Now, there is a lot of doubt whether this was a nuclear program meant to produce nuclear weapons, possibly. There are doubts. There have been questionable activity within Iran, but we also have to take into account that Iran was faced with a war where basically it was cut off from the world, and it had no other option than to start its own domestic program. Iran claims basically that it has a difference of opinion with the IAEA regarding the safeguards agreements. Dave mentioned that Iran was in violation. Yes, it was in violation. Iran's interpretation was that it did not have to report certain facilities 180 days before nuclear material was introduced into those facilities, which is the express provision of the safeguards agreement. The IAEA did not agree with that because of the subsidiary agreement that Iran has signed with the IAEA in 1975, I believe. Under that, the very design of those installations and facilities would have to be reported to the IAEA. So yes, Iran was in violation of that agreement. The process for, and going back to the question, the process for dealing with a possible, now we can't use breach because what the JCPOA uses, the term, is non-performance by JCPOA participants. The drafters have gone to great length to prevent any form of terminology that might relate to an international treaty in this agreement. Professor Sellers mentioned that there is a joint commission. They have 15 days to review a claim of non-performance by any claimant, including Iran. If Iran believes that the other sides are in non-performance, they can go to this joint commission. They have 15 days. After that, if it's not satisfactorily resolved, it goes to the ministerial level and or an advisory board composed of 3 people, 3 members. After that, if it's not, again, resolved, it can be referred to the UN Security Council, which Professor Sellers described in detail. Now, the question I'm particularly interested in is, and I don't have an answer for it, is what is non-performance or significant non-performance? And we have very detailed aspects to this JCPOA. You have 300 kilograms, for instance, of enriched uranium that Iran is allowed to have, 3.67% of enrichment. Now, if that 3.67% is 3.68, is that significant non-performance? We don't have a definition of that, and I'd like to hear if anyone has a comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any responses from any of the panelists? Yes.
Just one quick comment on what Tim said about this being an executive agreement. This is not an executive agreement, in my opinion. I've negotiated a dozen of them or more. There's, under the rubric of international agreements, there are treaties which have to go to the Senate for 2/3 advice and consent, which this should have been, but is not. There are executive agreements which are also legally binding, and then there are international agreements which are merely politically binding. That's what this one is. This is not an executive agreement.
Anyone else?
If I may, I'd also like to weigh in on the nature of it, because the terms used in the JCPOA point to a non-binding agreement. I mean, it talks of voluntary action, right? But you have commitments on both sides of the deal. And while they insisted that this is not a treaty, it very much looks like a treaty. I mean, Senator John McCain said you can call it a banana, but it's still a treaty. I'm not really sure if it is not a treaty, because if you look at the definition of a treaty under the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, this seems like one. But I'm not sure how they managed to get it out of Congress and Iran's majlis. They went to the UN Security Council instead.
Okay, the second of 4 plan questions. Given the fact that economic sanctions against Iran were clearly working, could and should the United States have taken a tougher, more aggressive stance in the negotiations? We'll start this one with Professor Sellers.
I was holding off on the other question a little bit, but one of the interesting things to think about as you consider something like this is the difference between international law and U.S. law, and what international law requires and what U.S. courts will enforce. And those are not necessarily the same thing. In other words, under U.S. law, it is the Congress that gets to define international law. And our courts will defer to Congress, and they will defer to the President. In other words, they'll defer to pretty much everybody who may have made a statement about how they should behave. So if the Congress or the President unambiguously states that they wish to violate international law, if the Congress formally passes, let's say, a law is passed in the United States through Congress and signed by the President, or the President simply states in a definitive manner that the United States wants to violate international law, U.S. courts will not enforce international law. The background assumption is that international law is part of the law of the United States, and U.S. courts will generally enforce the international legal obligations of the United States if they are stated clearly enough so that they're enforceable by courts. But even if they are very well known, U.S. courts will not enforce them if the President has clearly stated that he wants the United States to violate international law, or if it is done by the President and Congress in the form of a bill. And that's because our Constitution intends to give the President a great deal of discretion and Congress a great deal of discretion through law in defining how courts will behave. So with respect to the question of whether this is or is not an executive agreement, I think the definition of an executive agreement is a commitment made by the President of the United States to another country. So under that general definition, this is an executive agreement. But whether one wants to use, that's the standard vocabulary, but it doesn't matter whether you want to use that vocabulary or not, because with respect to our international law obligations, it doesn't matter whether it's an executive agreement or not. The United States has, in 2 different ways. The main and guiding international law rule here is simply Chapter 7, Article 41. In the Security Council Resolution 2231, which implements this agreement, passed 15-0 by the Security Council, formally decides almost all the main points using the word decide, which is a term of art under Article 41. So they decide, and then that becomes a legal obligation. The United States is a party to the United Nations. Iran, Israel, everybody's a party to the United Nations and is bound under Article 25 by these Security Council resolutions. So for the purposes of international law, there's no ambiguity at all. For the purposes of what U.S. courts will enforce, it's really up to the President. And presidents of the United States, our courts have said, if the President of the United States wants to violate a treaty, states that the treaty is void, our courts will respect that. So treaties, of course, are much more binding than executive agreements. So under U.S. law, there's a great deal of latitude for our President. Under international law, in a case like this, very little.
Well, given that latitude, could you answer the question that was posed? Could the U.S. have taken a tougher, perhaps more aggressive stance in the negotiations?
I think the answer is I don't really know, because I wasn't a party to the negotiations. But what the United States was trying to get, and what the other parties were trying to get, were promises from Iran that Iran didn't have to make. and the leverage we had was economic sanctions. So the question is how much do we think Iran wanted to get rid of the economic sanctions? And that's exactly how much leverage we had. It was mentioned, I don't think you explicitly mentioned, but this is an important point, that in 1970, under the Shah, when the United States started to give nuclear technology to Iran, Iran signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement. So there is a background treaty commitment that Iran has made in the past not to make nuclear weapons. And that is strongly reiterated in this agreement in perpetuity. So this promise already existed, and I think what this agreement is trying to do is have a more intense inspection regime than existed under the existing treaty arrangement.
Professor Movassagh, could and should the United States have taken a tougher stance?
If I may just follow up on what Professor Sellers said, because I agree with basically every word he just said. The resolution passed by the UN Security Council 2231 explicitly states that it's acting under, that all states will have to abide by its decision under Article 25. It's the, I think, the final preambular sentence in that resolution. So I think what I think it's the same situation in Iran as well. By law, I think that the president would have had to take this deal to the parliament in Iran, had it ratified as law, and then Iran would have been bound by it. But gathering from what Minister Zarif, Foreign Minister Zarif, has said repeatedly, there was a lot of concern that Congress and Iran's Majlis, who are, and the majority of whom are now the remnants of Ahmadinejad's administration, or proponents of him at least, would not have agreed to this deal. And you saw what happened in the U.S. Congress. A lot worse happened in Iran's parliament. I don't know if I should say this, but even Ali Akbar Salehi, the head of the Iran's Energy Association, was threatened to death in parliament. So that's the situation they were facing. What they did was they said, all right, we'll draft this as a non-binding agreement. We'll take it to the UN Security Council and have it binding on all states by virtue of the UN Charter. And they did so. With regard to the question, I'm not sure what a tougher, more aggressive stance in the negotiations really means. I mean, we've heard reports of Zarif and Kerry shouting at each other on numerous occasions, to an extent that the German foreign minister went into the room and said, calm down, everybody outside is hearing you. So they were really pushing their points. What were the points of the sanctions? The first line of the question asks, given the fact that the economic sanctions against Iran were working, how were they working? What were they trying to achieve is the question. I agree with Professor Sellers. What they were trying to achieve was Iran to accept certain restrictions in excess of what it had already accepted. Now, you may not know this, but in 2003, Iran did not ratify, and has not yet ratified, the additional protocol to the Safeguards Agreement. It had already ratified the NPT. It had already ratified the Safeguards Agreement. It has, since 1974, supported a nuclear-free weapons zone in the Middle East. In the General Assembly, you can look it up, it's there. But what the sanctions were trying to do was to get Iran to agree to further restrictions on its program. And that worked. So that was the purpose of the sanctions. And it worked. What other purpose would it have served? I'm not sure. If the purpose is thought to be that it would have stopped Iran's nuclear program, I disagree, because we had about less than 1,000 centrifuges. Ahmadinejad took power, decided to just ignore everything, went ahead with the program, increased the centrifuges to over 19,000. So it did not stop the nuclear program. It just put a lot of pressure on the middle class, who are, for better or worse, the only hope for democracy and human rights, the engine for that development in Iran.
Mr. Jonas?
If there's an easy answer to this question, could they take a tougher stance? The answer is, of course, they could have. This is the weakest negotiation team I've ever seen. And, you know, when somebody would come to me and say, hey, can you give me a legal opinion in an hour? My response is, you want it bad, you'll get it bad. That's what we got here. We wanted it bad. We got an administration who just wanted a deal more than anything in the world, and they got it bad. This is a horrible deal. Here's what they could have done. First, they could have kept the military option on the table. Believe it or not, when U.S. diplomats walk up to the table, then the folks on the other side of the table don't just see some skinny, polite guy negotiating. What they actually see is U.S. Marines behind him and offshore, ready to come in, kick down doors with bayonets fixed, and kill people. That's it. I'm a Marine. That's what they do. And that threat matters in diplomacy. Frederick the Great said, diplomacy without arms is like music without instruments. In other words, it doesn't work. So when you foolishly remove that threat, you give away you give away a major playing card, which is incredibly foolish. Second, we could have kept our red lines. We had two critical red lines out there. First was no enrichment and reprocessing. The second was anytime, anywhere inspections. Well, we gave them away, and they're critical pieces to this negotiation. If you stick with no enrichment and reprocessing, then you can't make a nuclear weapon. You have to either enrich, I know you're not nuclear engineers, I'm not either, but you have to either enrich uranium or reprocess spent fuel to get plutonium to make a nuclear weapon. Without it, you can't get one. Now, what does Iran need this stuff for anyway? They're sitting on a sea of oil, they got plenty of energy. Nuclear energy is expensive, by the way. Oil's cheap today, so it's not an economic argument. But we offered to give them fuel, which would have eliminated any question about their intent. But no, they want to enrich and reprocess by themselves. Enrich. Well, so why is that? And then, this very administration had what was called the gold standard. When we went out and negotiated what's called 123 agreements, named for Section 123 of the Atomic Energy Act, we would not, and we share our nuclear power for peaceful purposes with other states, and we do these 123 agreements, we don't let those other states enrich or reprocess, because that's how you get a nuclear weapon. That's part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act of 1978. It's been a critical piece of our strategy and our non-proliferation policy, and it's this very administration who came up with the term the gold standard. And yet, you know, if we won't do it for South Korea, an ally, but we're going to do it for an enemy state like Iran. We're going to let them enrich. I've never heard of such stuff. And finally, we could have made it legally binding, which, of course, would have made it a much stronger thing. I just want to take one issue with what Tim said. He said that Iran promised not to make nuclear weapons in this deal. Well, yes, they did, but for you international lawyers out there, you know there's two aspects to international agreements. There's the preamble, which is not legally binding, and the operative paragraphs, which are legally binding. That language was in the preface, which is not legally binding. So even though it's not a legally binding agreement, it's politically binding, but Iran is not even bound because of the placement of that critical language in this agreement. Iran is not even bound by it not to make nuclear weapons. So it's a horrible deal. We could have taken a much tougher approach.
In light of Professor Jonas's comments, which were actually an answer to our predetermined question 4, I'm going to ask the other two panelists to comment on question 4. I'll read it. Were there, in fact, no other options available to the United States other than to sign the agreement? Professor Jonas, I think, has already addressed that question. So, Professor Movassagh.
Oh, sure. I agree with Professor Jonas that there is always the option of war. And I'm sure he's aware that there have been countless reports, analyses, war games, simulations, and even actual military maneuvers in the U.S. and Iran on this very issue for decades. Or, well, at least I know of these dating back about 14, 13 years ago. So these have been explored. None of them, short of an all-out war, leading up to an invasion of Iran, removing the Iranian regime, would have had the result that was desirable in controlling Iran's nuclear program. But we have to ask, would that have been an option? Yes, that would have been an option. General Dempsey said in the Senate Arms Hearings Committee hearing, when asked, was there no other option, he said that, Senators, my job is to ensure that America always has options, yes. But what would have been the best option? Taking out the Natanz facility itself would have required bunker buster weapons. Now, I've seen simulations of those weapons. They would have had fatalities as far as, and under certain assessments, depending on the wind and all that, India. So I'm not sure if that would have been a good option. I think that negotiating and dealing is not a show of weakness. I actually think it's a show of strength. If you're willing to negotiate, get what you want, and I think they did get what they wanted, everybody, to a certain extent they compromised. I don't agree that this is a weak deal at all. I think it addresses the legitimate concerns everybody had with Iran's nuclear program. I think that Iran got what it wanted to a certain extent. And might I add that Professor Jonas says we would have given them the fuel. The fuel was not being provided by the consortium that Iran was a shareholder of. So, no, I don't think they would have given them the fuel. The argument that they're sitting on a sea of oil, what do they need nuclear energy for? We were sitting on a sea of oil in the 70s. But back then, Henry Kissinger said they were our allies. Now they're not. It's as simple as that. So I don't think the rules should change based on alliances.
Professor Sellers, were there in fact no other options available to the United States other than to sign the agreement?
Well, I guess the question is other options to what purpose? I want to get back. I guess I'm focused on law. The United States is a law-abiding country. The United States was founded to respect law, including international law, and to serve justice. So we care about law, I think, in this country. The question was raised whether or not Iran is bound by law not to make nuclear weapons. Yes, they're absolutely bound by law not to make nuclear weapons. They're party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the Security Council under Chapter 7 has told them not to make nuclear weapons, so twice over. Now, that doesn't mean they won't disobey the law. It's possible that they will. But with regard to their legal obligations, those are unquestioned. With regard to the legal obligations of the United States cannot legally bomb Iran unless Iran makes an armed attack on us or one of our allies. So now you can interpret armed attack pretty broadly, and the United States is, we could feel threatened to a point that we felt that something constituted an armed attack before an armed attack was actually made. But I don't think that the United States is going to unilaterally bomb any country without something more threatening than what we're facing right now from Iran. So I think I agree very much with Mr. Jonas that it's very important in our negotiations that people know that we're a powerful and dangerous country. But I think they also know that we're a law-abiding and a decent country, and that may limit how scared they are sometimes, because there are certain things that the United States would never do.
Follow-up?
Yes.
The possibility of an armed attack on Iran was anticipated. This was not something that was off the table at any time. We heard on multiple occasions that all options are on the table, which really angered certain officials in Iran because they said, how are we supposed to negotiate when you're threatening us with armed attack? And they had anticipated that. But again, going back to the Natanz facility, I've heard from civil engineers that even the people who work there don't exactly know where the ducts actually go out, the air ducts, because they anticipate that they would use a missile against that facility. So they've dug air ducts that lead nowhere. How are you going to destroy that facility? Again, the military option might have set Iran, even if they could have figured out how to hit Natanz and destroy the centrifuges over there, it would have maybe set them back 2 or 3 years. It would not have stopped the program. What the deal does is it provides restrictions on every aspect of nuclear mining, of uranium mining, procurement, refabrication, everything, the front end and the back end of the nuclear process have been addressed. And there are restrictions in excess of any international safeguard in this JCPOA, and I don't think it's a weak deal at all.
Okay, thank you. We'll move to our last of our preordained questions. This is a somewhat more detailed, specific question. Just recently, international nuclear inspectors visited the secret Iranian military site in Parchin, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, Parchin, and discovered that key equipment seen on satellite imagery was missing from the site. International nuclear inspectors claim that this makes it harder to test for radioactive residue. How can the United States and other countries perhaps, how can the United States in particular, prevent Iran from hiding nuclear weapons if Iran is given a warning and a period of time before inspections are allowed to take place? We'll start with Professor Jonas.
First, I had an opportunity to talk very briefly about this with Rudy Giuliani, and I only say this not to drop names because this is a funny story, and I don't want to take credit where credit is not due to me. But he said, when I was the U.S. attorney for Southern District of New York or whatever, he was prosecuting a mob guy named Fat Tony somebody, some Sicilian name. And he said, could you imagine me calling up Fat Tony and saying, hey, Fat Tony, this is Rudy. Hey, how you doing? Listen, I got a warrant to search your place in 24 days, so don't move anything, but I'll be there in 24 days, okay? Don't change a thing. Well, that's how ridiculous this is. And not only is Iran going to take 24 days, they're going to take more than that. They are going to, as a matter of fact, one of my colleagues made reference earlier to the fact that the deal stops Iran from enriching over 3.67%. They're going to enrich to 4, 5, 10. They're going to see where they get caught. They're going to see what they can get away with. They're going to break this deal at every step of the game. The fact that there's all these provisions in there and they've all been negotiated, remember, it's non-binding, and the IAEA has limited resources, and they're only going to be able to discover so much. They're going to delay and deceive, and then when by some miracle we get intelligence, actionable, real intelligence about a secret site where something's actually happening in violation of the deal, they're going to bulldoze the site before we get there. We read reports already about Iran wanting their own people to provide soil samples for the IAEA inspectors to test. That's how ridiculous this is. Just today, I read that Iran has stopped dismantling nuclear enrichment facilities at 2 of its sites, which they're bound to do under the deal. And what we're going to get is this constant dribble of information where Iran violates the deal, to greater or lesser extent. And, we're going to debate, well, is that a substantial agreement? And he's right. If they enriched to 3.8%, well, is that a substantial violation? Maybe it was an accident. It won't be an accident. This is all intentional, part of a larger plan. And I think we're going to realize pretty quickly down the road what a disaster this agreement is. One quibble with the question about, it says when they get nuclear weapons. Before they get nuclear weapons, something is going to happen. What we're talking about is if they're enriching to 20%, 30%, 40%, you need maybe 70, 80% for a nuclear weapon. You have to enrich. The problem is that about 75% of the work is done in terms of enriching to nuclear weapons standard when you get to about 10 or 20%. So that's the problem here, and that's where the race comes in. But Israel will act, quite frankly, if there is actionable intelligence about Iran really reaching nuclear weapons capability. Remember, Iran needs more than one nuclear weapon. Only a terrorist needs one nuclear weapon. Although with Iran, it's kind of hard to tell the difference between a terrorist and a state. But a state needs a nuclear weapons program where you have 10 or 20 nuclear weapons or more. Israel will act because they have to. Their tripwire is lower than ours. 1, 2, 3 nuclear weapons and Israel is gone. I hate to say this, we're a big country. 1, 2, or 3 nuclear weapons can land on us. We could actually take it, survive, fire back. It would be a horrific disaster and catastrophe. I realize it, but that's why our tripwire is much higher than Israel's. Thanks.
Mr. Sellers.
I think the question was, what can the United States do to prevent cheating? And the answer is they've got to rely, very little, spying is what they can do, and rely on the IAEA. And then if the United States is dissatisfied at any time, the United States can go to the Security Council and get the sanctions reimposed. So with a slight difference in tone, I think I'm basically saying the same thing that you just said, that the United States has got a limited number of things it can do, and the main thing it can do is to kick back the sanctions if it wants to. In other words, it can go as or bomb, but I think that's unlikely to happen unless there's some serious threat of actual nuclear weapons.
I agree with Dave in that a nuclear weapon in the hands of a terrorist is horrific for everyone. And as an Iranian, I really hope that Iran never gains a nuclear weapon. I think it's a dangerous proposition. It puts it in danger more than it would do good for it. But I'm also concerned about nuclear weapons anywhere, including in Pakistan and including in other countries. With regard to the question, yes, I believe Fat Tony would have been able to empty out his house within 24 hours. But the IAEA inspections regime provides for ad hoc, routine, and special inspections. Now, under those safeguards agreements, they may have 24 hours. I don't think that you can empty out a nuclear facility within 24 hours. Iran provisionally applied the additional protocol in 2003 until 2005. The additional protocol allows inspections within 2 hours. I cannot for the life of me consider that a nuclear facility would be emptied out, hollowed out, with no trace of any nuclear material within 2 hours. It's, at least for me, it's inconceivable. This is something, there's an interview with Hans Blix, you can look it up on the internet. He says nuclear material is not something you can flush down the toilet. It's going to leave residue. You can remodel, you can paint over, you're going to be detected. It's not something that can be that can go unnoticed. So I'm fairly confident that if there is something, there is a concern. I agree with Dave in this, that Iran is a large country, and if there is not reliable intelligence, I'm not sure how they would be able to find those facilities without Iran's notification of those facilities to the IAEA. But I don't believe for a second that Iran wants to develop a nuclear weapon to use it against any other country, because it's suicide. I don't see any rational human being doing that to themselves. I mean, I've heard the arguments that it's an ideological state. Yes, I've felt the burn of that state myself, but not for a second do I think that they would use a nuclear weapon, because they would be wiped out off the map.
Okay, that concludes the formal questions and responses from the panel. Anyone in the audience who has a question is invited to step up to the mic, or I see Ashley's pulled it aside, just step up to the front. And while you're gathering yourselves, if you want to, up front, I'll take the prerogative of the chair and ask my own question. I don't think I'll get in a chance to have another one to get in edgewise, but I'm going to ask this question that I think I'm going to start with my good friend and colleague Tim Sellers on this, and try to pull him out of his preoccupation with the law, even though we're all law professors. Why? Because, well, Tim Sellers' wife is a reporter, or works for the Washington Post. Doesn't she still work there, Tim? Okay. So why did the United States refuse to include other issues in this negotiation on this agreement? I'm not the first one to ask this question, such as the return of political hostages, specifically the Washington Post reporter who's been held there for over a year, supplying arms to terrorist groups, and the continued demonization of and threats to Israel by Iranian leaders. Why did the United States hold back on that, do you think? And I'll start with Tim, and be happy to hear from the other two panelists, and then we have a line already formed.
Well, the reason I keep saying that what I'm willing to talk about is the legal situation is because I don't know anything about the non-legal situation. My knowledge is limited to law, which I think is very important, and the legal commitments the United States has under international or under U.S. law. With respect to the illegal seizure of several Americans in Iran on trumped-up charges for things that they never did, I think it's an outrage. And I don't know why, in the context of these negotiations, we didn't do more to save these people. I suspect that somebody made the judgment that it was more important to get the deal than to save the people. But that's just supposition, because I don't know.
Professor Movassagh, you want to weigh in on that one?
Yeah, I don't think that the deal was more important than the lives of the people. I believe that the issue had been raised. And I say this because reading between the lines of what the foreign ministers and Secretary of State said in their interviews, I think the issues were raised, but I think it was smart of them to focus on this deal and not go into other issues, because it would have opened up a whole can of worms. Iran would have come up with a lot of issues. 5 of its nuclear scientists were assassinated in terrorist attacks, what I call terrorist attacks. That would have been an issue. A lot of other issues would have been brought to the floor, and I think that would have wasted a lot of time. I think they went ahead with this deal, focused on the issues at hand, which was difficult enough. This was not a deal negotiated in 2 years. This was a deal that is being negotiated since 2003. The latest round, with the inclusion of the U.S., was since 2013, I think. But it's been going on for a while. So I think they had to get this done, and then they can move on to other issues. And I think they are still continuing their discussions on other issues, including the imprisonment of the Iranian Americans and the newly imprisoned journalists in Iran.
I think I know where Professor Jonas is going to come down on this one, but I'll let him speak for himself.
Just very quickly, normally I would actually believe that we should not include such provisions, because having negotiated these kinds of agreements in the past, look, we've got 3 million American expatriates living overseas. Every time one of them, by the way, this guy isn't even a U.S. government employee. He's not only a reporter, he's also an Iranian citizen also. So, I mean, he's kind of subject to Iranian law. Normally I'd say, hey, man, you're on your own. However, at the very last 12th hour of the negotiation, the Iranians did open it up to other things about getting in ballistic missiles after 8 years, ballistic missile sales. Once they did that, we should have said, okay, man, the door's open. Let's now talk about the hostages and other stuff. But we didn't do that, again, because we're such bad negotiators.
Thanks very much. And I'll ask each of the people who steps up to the mic, please identify yourself briefly and then ask your question.
Hi, my name is Andrew Koch. I'm a student here at the University of Baltimore. Thank you all for coming tonight. Thanks to the Jewish Law Students Association for putting this on. I guess I have a question first for Mr. Jonas, and actually I'll address this to the entire panel. Mr. Jonas had said about how Americans aren't even allowed in to inspect any of the sites, even as part of a contingency from the IAEA. I guess my question is, that seems to strike me as a violation of law, that, how is Iran getting to choose who gets to come in, what nationalities get to come in to inspect the sites? I mean, they're the ones who are suspected of violating international law and international agreements, nuclear agreements, and yet they're saying, British can inspect the sites, French can inspect the sites, but the Americans can't, or the Israelis can't. Where does Iran get off on saying that from a legal perspective? And another question I have to, I forget your name, sir. I'm sorry, what?
Hooman.
To Hooman. If you say this deal is not a weak deal, can it at least be a better deal than as it stands right now? Thank you for your answers.
Let me just take briefly the first question, which was to me, once again, I go back to the principle that we're extremely poor negotiators and we just wanted this deal at all costs. Therefore, even though normally Iran would not ever get to say who could be an inspector, because they threw it out there and we foolishly agreed to it, And by the way, remember, this is 5-6 world powers against a fairly questionable regional power right now, and yet the regional powers seem to get everything they wanted, and the P5+1 didn't do very well. So we absolutely didn't have to agree to it, but we agreed to it. Once you agree to it, it can become part of the deal. I mean, they could have, you could put crazy things into an agreement that have absolutely no business being there, but if there's agreement to it, then it's part of the deal.
Anybody else on the panel?
Sure, yeah. With regard to the Americans not being allowed in, even as IAEA and EA inspectors, it comes as a surprise to me as well how they managed to negotiate that one in. But it has precedent. If you read Mohammed al-Baradi's book, The Age of Deception, he mentions in he doesn't hold back. The American inspectors did not do a good job professionally, in his view, in inspecting Iraqi sites. That, coupled with the assassination of Iranian scientists, I think led to the belief that the IAEA is the chief inspector, and it can pick anyone that they want as inspectors, as long as they don't come from the U.S. or Israel. Let's not forget that Iran was also subject to an attack on its enrichment facilities, Stuxnet virus, which, according to the U.S. itself, constitutes an armed attack. So we have that precedent, which is not very favorable to Americans being present in the inspections team. With regard to the second, I don't know if Professor Sellers wants to add anything to that? Or?
No, I'm happy.
Okay. Could it be a better deal? I've heard this thrown around quite a bit. I'm not quite sure what a better deal is, and I'm not an American yet, but I'm not quite in agreement with Professor Jonas that you have bad negotiators. I think the U.S. has enough diplomats, seasoned diplomats, experts in every field. I don't think they are bad negotiators. I think they got what they wanted. I think they negotiated for a specific thing, and that's what they got. Could it have been a better deal? I have not seen, read, or heard of anyone providing a better option. I don't know what is meant by a better deal. During the Armed Services Committee hearing in the Senate, the only one who came out and said it was Senator Lindsey Graham. He said, "Who wins in a war with Iran? We do." So I think it's a unicorn. There is no better deal. This is a good deal as it stands. What they wanted was war, and this prevents that, at least for the time being, depending on what developments take place over the next decade. I'm not sure if war is preventable, but let's see it. For the time being, that this deal prevents that.
I guess I do have a reaction, which is we're spending a lot of time in our conversation this evening regretting or not regretting the deal that was made. And I think that's a waste of time because the deal exists. It's the law. So the question for us is, what is our attitude towards this law? And so under international law, we're bound. Under U.S. law, the president can do whatever he likes. So I think the conversation really now is, to what extent do we want to respect our commitments? To what extent do we think they're so bad that we want to violate? That's the question, I think. The question whether it was a good idea when it was done is a question that is now for historians. It's done.
Let me throw in my 2 cents on that one. First of all, I think that there was a better deal. I've read plenty of places that have said there was a better deal, and that was simply to walk away from the negotiations. As far as the train already having left the station, the American public is still very much up in the air about this deal, and the American public is perhaps up in the air about who the next president will be. So the continued conversation about this deal, I think, is important for the upcoming presidential debates and decisions by American citizens as to which candidate to vote for, because that next candidate is liable to either endorse the deal or to adamantly oppose it, and as Professor Sellers says, the next president can take his own stance on this agreement. That's my 2 cents.
May I add something to what you just said?
You're certainly entitled to under our rules.
All right. Walking away to me does not sound like a deal. It is not a better deal. It's no deal. What I mean by a better deal is what else would have the P5+1 and the EU wanted to ensure that Iran's program would be peaceful, and that they have not already incorporated in this deal. I've read the deal back to back. I don't see how else. I mean, if the IAEA believes that it can, verify that through these extra restrictions placed on Iran, and that it will be in a better position to verify that it is solely peaceful. If the P5+1 are in agreement, if the 15 members of the Security Council are in agreement, what else was there to put into that deal that has not been put there to make it a better deal? Walking away to me is not a better deal. It's no deal.
Okay, next question.
Hi, my name is Sam Shirazi. I graduated from UVA Law, where Hooman was my professor, so I'm a little biased. I'll ask him the question. I guess we've talked a lot about Iran, and we've talked a little bit about kind of the dynamics in the U.S., but I think the Iranian regime is very complicated, and I think there are rational components, there are less rational components, and it's a very complicated mix. So I guess the question, from a legal perspective, who makes the shot at the end of the day? Is it the supreme leader who, we might not be able to trust, or is it the president of Iran who seems like a more rational actor? And just kind of that dynamic in terms of who are we dealing with, and who makes the ultimate calls in terms of approving the deal or approving a nuclear bomb or not approving a nuclear bomb? I mean, who does that in the Iranian context?
Right. It's a good question, and I wish I had a definite answer for you. I've studied law in Iran, and on paper it's one thing, in practice it's another thing, and the dynamic changes regularly. I mean, I was just talking to Professor Sellers that the Iranian parliament passed a law not 3 weeks ago, just about three weeks ago maybe, concerning this JCPOA. In it, they reference a fatwa by Khamenei that prohibits the production and use of nuclear weapons. Now, that fits within the Islamic laws of war. I have not seen the fatwa. I've looked for it. I have not seen it. I might have missed it because their websites are not really organized well. But they've incorporated that in the Act of Parliament, and it's by law now prohibited to produce or use nuclear weapons. That act exists. Now, who calls the shots? Yeah, legally, it's the ultimate power rests with the supreme leader. I mean, he even influences the decision on appointing the foreign minister, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Minister of Intelligence, and Minister of the Interior. But his comments are usually in broad brushes. He rarely makes decisions and dictates what should be done in specifics. He provides policy guidelines, if you will, and the rest is up to the administration at the time. And we've seen on numerous occasions the Ahmadinejad administration ignoring him completely. Rouhani hasn't gone that far, but I think that he is finding room within those policy guidelines to do what he needs to do to get this deal moving forward.
I don't have any insights into Iran at all, but I wanted to respond to Professor Lassen's remark earlier, which is basically that, what is the point of talking about this now? And I think the point is, what should the U.S. do in the future with respect to our international law obligations? So I think there's three questions that are actually worth answering. These are the 3 questions I would have asked us. But the first is, should the U.S. president violate our international obligations? In other words, should an incoming U.S. president denounce the Security Council resolution and in some way try to violate it? I think that would France, Germany, Great Britain, Russia, China, the European Union, all of them would be against us if we did that. I think it's extremely unlikely that anybody, even all the candidates who are currently running, none of them, I think, would do that. So I don't think that that's a likely result. But that's one possibility. Then a second thing to consider is what would Iran have to do to trigger our decision to reoppose sanctions, as can be done under this agreement. So what kind of violation, and it's our call. So Mr. Jonas, talked about how there are ambiguities here, and there are definitely ambiguities, but it's our call. We have to decide for ourselves at what point would we trigger the sanctions again. If we did it too readily, again, we would get into trouble with all the other parties to this agreement. But it's a decision we can make. It's in our power to make it. And then the third question is, what would Iran have to do to make us feel justified acting under Article 51 and using force? And again, the threshold for that, I think, is very high, because we don't want the whole international community to be arrayed against us. But there probably is some point at which we would want to do that. And I think those are the questions that our presidential candidate should be considering. At what point do we want to reimpose sanctions, and at what point? Because I agree with Mr. Jonas. I think it's highly likely there will be violations. Some of them may seem pretty trivial, but then the question is, what's our reaction? So I think that's the question that I find interesting. Under existing law,
Right.
what should the United States be doing? And I think our presidential candidates have to answer those questions.
A very brief comment on that. Things change so rapidly, especially the texture of the Middle East. Even in the past few weeks, we've seen alliances torn down and grow. So who would have thought a year ago that we might be on the same track as Russia and even Iran when it comes to ISIS or ISIL in Syria? Who knows what alliances are going to be in place a year from now if things happen. Next question.
May I add to just what you just mentioned? A quick note about alliances. I'm not sure if Professor Jonas knows about this, but Ambassador Ryan Crocker, U.S. Ambassador to the Middle East, gave a lecture, I think, last year at UVA. And I knew this coming out of Iran, but he said it at UVA. When the U.S. wanted to go to war with Iraq and Afghanistan, they actually sat down with Iranian military personnel, and they got the maps from those personnel, those military commanders. And Ryan Crocker, he said that they told us, look, if we were going to do this, this is how we would do it. He said next week we started military operations. So there have been cooperations between Iran and the U.S. There has been friction between Iran and the U.S. I don't think that either of them there's a love-hate relationship, I think, between Iran and the U.S. I don't think either of them want to go to that place where we would have an all-out war.
Okay, next question. How much more time do we have? One more question after this, okay? Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Tal Ledetsky. I'm a third-year student here at UB. And, Professor Sellers, you actually kind of took one of my questions right out of my mouth. No, it's good, but I luckily have another one. So I don't know how many other people did this, but sometime after the deal was struck, I kind of phased out myself out of it on the radio, and just kind of went about. But before I did so, I heard a lot of political discussion about the kind of effects that this deal could have under nearby countries which would purportedly could live under the umbrella of a nuclear Iran. What I'm curious about from a strictly legal perspective is how the law can act to either inhibit or enhance other actors' change of hearts about whether they would pursue nuclear capabilities. I know I'd heard, and I don't know if this is something that is just going to turn out to be one of those false things you hear in the news, but I heard the soundbite of Saudi Arabia saying that what Iran has, Saudi Arabia will pursue. So to that extent, then, how does the current law, given this kind of anomaly of what we have really with Iran and the opportunity that they have to really kind of circumvent it with very little immediate enforcement, how do you feel legally that this plays into the area in terms of advantaging one nation over the other? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks. Just remember that every state has signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Every state except for India, Pakistan, Israel, and of course North Korea that pulled out.
South Sudan.
Excuse me?
I think South Sudan was also the fourth one. I'm sorry.
Oh.
I didn't want to interrupt.
So, they've already taken on a legally binding commitment not to produce nuclear weapons, except for the P5 that under the NPT may have nuclear weapons but are supposed to negotiate in good faith towards disarmament. So because of that structure, really, which has held. I know people talk about the NPT falling apart, and really, if Iran gets nuclear weapons, and which causes a cascade of nuclear weapons, states, which would be the predictions are that Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Turkey would have nuclear weapons. At that point, the NPT would probably begin to collapse. But what they mean by that, what Saudi Arabia means by that, is that because those two states are vying for regional geopolitical power, if Iran has nuclear weapons, that's the whole point. This deal has upset the geopolitical balance of power and created natural allies, for example, out of Israel and Saudi Arabia. Iran will obey international law to the extent that, like North Korea, when they get their nuclear weapon, they'll pull out of the NPT, they'll violate, they'll negate their signature on the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and then they'll test their nuclear weapon. Because you kind of have to test a nuclear weapon unless you're going to have the most basic kind, if you're going to produce them, mass produce them. So I think that all that Saudi Arabia means is we're going to get, if Iran's going to enrich, then we're going to enrich too. And America, you better do a deal with us that gives us the very same technologies and authorities. But again, Iran is not any state. I mean, it has been U.S. policy for years that no state that we deal with in the peaceful guise of nuclear energy would get the enrichment technology. Now that Iran has that, it's kind of broken the mold. So I don't know how we can say to allies like Saudi Arabia that you can't have it, even though we just gave it to Iran.
The benefit of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is that it does establish this principle that there should not be nuclear weapons. And then part of that is the promise that the nuclear weapon countries made that they would gradually diminish their own reliance on nuclear weapons. So that's an important part of it. I think the benefit, among the benefits of the United Nations Security Council resolution on this matter is that it strengthens the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as it applies to Iran, because it makes it a Chapter 7 resolution in addition to being a treaty. And so that takes off the table the option of simply withdrawing. Now, obviously, they can violate a treaty, but they're now legally bound. And I think that's one of the reasons it's so important to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. I mean, we saw China had weapons, so therefore India felt they had weapons, and India had weapons, and therefore Pakistan felt they had weapons. So I agree that it's very, very important for us to maintain our own commitments under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and under the United Nations Security Council resolution.
Okay.
May I just, sorry.
Go ahead.
I'd like to thank you. It's an excellent question and a valid concern of all. I agree with what Professor Jonas and Sellers have just said, with one caveat with regard to what Professor Jonas said, because under the existing regulatory framework, they already have that right. So it's not a question of, so you made a deal with Iran, they can have a nuclear enrichment facility, we're going to have it as well. They already have that right under the NPT. They can have, and Hans Blinks has already attested to this as well, and so does the IAEA. They can have that. It's a question of controlling it. It's a question of limiting it, and it's a question of ensuring that they don't divert that facility into, because it's the same process. You enrich uranium to 3.67% or 5% for a nuclear reactor. You can enrich it to 90%. It's a centrifuge just revolving, and build a bomb. So how do you go around controlling and ensuring that none of these countries produce a nuclear weapon? That's a challenge. And I'm not sure if the current regulatory framework would sufficiently address that, but it's what we have. We can discuss how better it would be, to strengthen the IAEA, but that's a whole different topic, but it's an excellent question. I agree with you.
Thank you. Last question of the evening.
Hi, my name's Jared Lerner. I'm a second-year law student here at the university. I'm also the treasurer of the Jewish Law Student Association, so on behalf of the association, thank you again for coming to speak with us. My question might be a little bit more politically biased than others, but Professor Jonas, you touched upon this briefly about if Iran does get close to developing a nuclear weapon, even if the United States doesn't do anything, Israel will step in and take action. And so based on the, I would say, current trend of kind of removing the United States out of international affairs in the Middle East, Syria, which I know we just sent people over there, where does the United States stand as far as in the negotiations, in the agreement? Is there any language where if Israel is to take that action, will the United States back Israel in that? And that's probably going to be dictated by the new administration that comes in. Or is it the United States going to take a step back and say, we did this deal with Iran, we're going to stick by it?
Well, it's a good question. I think there's nothing in the deal about that. And these kinds of things would be, at most, sub rosa kinds of tacit understandings. I think, look, it's very difficult for Israel to attack, given their military resources and the distance of Iran, and the fact that Iran has learned from the Israeli bombing of Iraq's Osirak reactor and even Syria's Al-Kabar reactor in 2004. However, if the United States were to declare it a strict policy, and visibly and internationally, that Iran will not attain a nuclear weapon, or we will act, that would be a good thing to do. In the absence of that, I would like us to empower Israel to act by giving them the tools they need to do this. The United States was developing in the Bush administration what was called RNEP, Robust Nuclear Earth Penetrator, a nuclear weapon that would penetrate. But of course, that problem with that is that breaks the nuclear threshold that hasn't been broken for a nuclear weapon being fired in anger since 1945. So what we in the military developed was called the MOP, the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, which is a 15,000-pound conventional weapon, which can also penetrate hard and deeply buried targets like many of Iran's nuclear sites. Coincidentally, again, who puts peaceful nuclear reactors under a mountain guarded by anti-air missiles? Russia, of course, is always being so helpful to us, which is why I just question Tim's, I know Tim is absolutely right that we can go to the UN Security Council and complain, but because our good friends the Russians and the Chinese are there, they may try to block what we do. And make no mistake about it, Russia and China would like to see nothing better than having us bogged down in the Middle East so that China's free to do what they want in the South China Sea and Russia's free to do what they want in Ukraine. But I think if we gave Israel the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, and of course, unfortunately, they need a delivery system for it also, which would be the B-2 bomber. If we gave them that, to give them that option, then they could act effectively. Without those tools and simply the current Israeli Air Force as currently configured with the F-15s that they have and the other conventional armaments that they have, I don't think they could do it. I think what you'll see, my personal prediction, is that you will see an Israeli electromagnetic pulse weapon detonated in the air. It would be a nuclear weapon being used, but no one would be killed by it. That would fry the Iranian electrical grid, which would ultimately cause deaths, but in a different way. And I think that would prevent the Iranian program from acting. Israel is certainly not going to send in troops. There may be special operations forces, but not conventional forces, obviously. Naval forces won't do the trick. The Israeli Air Force would have a hard time with this, particularly once they get the Russian S-300 anti-air missiles. So I think that's about all they can do, or actually use a nuclear weapon. But that would be a pretty drastic step to take.
I have I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Can I go first?
Yes, please.
I have three things to say in response to your question. The first is, this is just a question of prediction, and I have no idea, but I think it highly unlikely, unless it feels very much more threatened than it does right now, that Israel would initiate a war with Iran. I think it would be very imprudent, and I don't think they're likely to do it. I think they want the United States to do it, but I don't think they'll do it, because it would be stupid, unless they're very much more threatened than they are right now. That could happen. And then with respect to the, I just want to clarify with respect to something that was just said. The United States does have the capacity, under the treaty as it exists, to snap back the sanctions if it wants to, because the way it's structured with the Security Council is the Security Council has to positively say no. And because we have got veto in the Security Council won't say no, because we can prevent them from saying no. So we do have the ability, if we want to do that. And then the third thing I wanted to say is just how well, first of all, how grateful I am to people who are willing to come, give their time to the University of Baltimore by sitting here on a stage and talking to our students. It really, means a lot to all of us that you're here. And with that, how impressed I am by our students asking us questions that are much better and much clearer than the answers we're giving to your questions. So I just wanted to say that I personally have been very impressed by the organization of this event and by the students who have asked us questions, and I thank you for that.
Right. Thank you for your question. I'm not as familiar with military ordinances as Professor Jonas, but there has been a war game, I think a simulation conducted by the Brookings Institution exactly on that scenario, and it's a good question. It has been contemplated by Iran as well. I'm not sure what the long-term benefits of an EMP would be in stopping Iran's nuclear program, but let's imagine that Israel did strike Iran, even if the weapons were provided by the U.S. Whether or not the U.S. would want to, I think it would be drawn into that conflict. But it depends on what reaction the Iranians would give to that strike. Iranians would definitely consider the fact that the U.S. would back up Israel. It's my personal assessment. I think that the U.S. would back Israel on that strike. And if Iran were to engage Israel in a military conflict, I think just search on Google U.S. military bases in the Middle East. It's all around Iran. I don't think it would be a good idea for Iran. But I'm not sure what benefits a strike on even the nuclear installations and facilities in Iran would provide to Israel, other than delaying the program, which is already, I think, restricted to a remarkable extent under the deal. Again, it goes back to what Professor Jonas said. How would we be able to, for absolute certainty, know that Iran is complying and is not and constructing new facilities elsewhere? Because yes, it does believe that it anticipates these strikes. That's why it's under a mountain. I've driven by it, and it is under a mountain, believe me. You can't see it, but you can see anti-aircraft guns for miles and miles. Now, those could be taken out, I believe, from the other side of the earth by modern weaponry, but they exist, and it's a pretty scary sight. You drive from Tehran to Esfahan, and it's on both sides of the road, and you can see the mountain that facility is based under. I don't think even a nuclear weapon could take it out. To be honest, I've seen the mountain, and it is a mountain. You can look it up on the internet, see the topology of the place. I'm not sure if it works. They'll just build it in another location. It's a delay tactic at best.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm sure that we could continue this for some time, but I'll echo what Tim Sellers said. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to our panelists for appearing at UB on a Tuesday evening. And thank you for the good questions, and thank you to the International Law Society and the Jewish Law Students Association for sponsoring this event. Please drive carefully. Thanks. Bye.
I apologize for interrupting you there. I'm sorry. I just came out to South Sudan. I'm sorry about that. I enjoyed it. Learned a lot. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ken.
Good job. Moderators got to be neutral.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're in your last year?
Thank you. 2 semesters of one student each.
Yeah. Good to see you. Thanks for coming to the talk.
Enjoy it.
Good.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Really? I definitely. I don't want someone to watch some of them.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
See you.
Very well. All right. Thank you. No, it's good listening. Ci sarebbe da spiegare anche شما گفت
Had a good balance. Very good question. Very good question.
به نظر من یا کسی اینو خونده باشه